Chapter 5. Never Give Up. It was the perfect job for Rachel, and the weekly broadcast soon became a huge success. Not long after she started, Rachel was asked by Mr. Higgins if she would like to write an introduction to a booklet about fish. Rachel jumped at the chance. She stayed up late writing at the piece. She wanted it to be perfect. When Rachel showed the introduction, the word of waters, to Mr. Higgins the next day, he shook his head. Rachel was surprised. What could be wrong with it? Rachel's boss told her that the introduction was too good. He told her it should be published in a magazine, not in a government booklet. Although Rachel loved her job, she still wasn't making enough money to really help her family. She started writing articles for magazines and newspapers to earn extra money. All this work meant Rachel didn't have much free time. And she was tired a lot. But she was doing what she loved, writing about nature. Rachel decided to try to sell the piece her boss had called Too Good. She did some more work on The World of Waters and sent it to The Athletic Monthly, an important magazine that was known for recognizing new writers. They agreed to publish it if Rachel made some changes and gave it a new title, Under the Sea. When the article appeared in the magazine, Rachel showed it to Mr. Higgins. Once again, Mr. Higgins shook his head. Now what could be wrong with it? Rachel wondered. This time, Mr. Higgins said it should be an entire book and not just a magazine article. Rachel's boss wasn't the only one who thought her work should be more than an article in a magazine. Quincy Ho, an editor at Simon and Schuster Publishing Company, and William Van Loon, a famous naturalist, both wrote to Rachel. They persuaded Rachel to turn her article into a book. Because Rachel was a perfectionist and because she was also working full-time, it took her 3 years to finish her first book. But in 1941, Under the Sea Wind was published. Her book was filled with stories and interesting facts about the creatures that lived in the sea. It also showed how their lives are connected. Rachel used words that someone who wasn't a scientist could easily understand and enjoy. Rachel's book received excellent reviews, but it didn't sell well. 1 month after Under the Sea Wind was published, the United States entered World War II. Suddenly the country was at war, and people were worried about how their lives would change. No one was interested in reading a book about sea life and the ocean. Rachel was upset that even though the book got good reviews, very few people bought and read it. She even told a friend, "Don't ever write a book." Because she was so discouraged by the lack of sales for Under the Sea Wind. The Fish and Wildlife Service, the new name for the Bureau of Fisheries, was very busy during the war. They moved their offices from Washington, D.C. to Chicago in the spring of 1942 and hired Rachel to work on the Food from the Sea series. War rationing meant that people were eating more fish and less meat. The Food from the Sea bulletins were a way to teach people about different kinds of fish. In the spring of 1943, the Fish and Wildlife Services moved back to Washington, D.C., and Rachel moved to a house in Silver Spring, Maryland. Rachel's mother, brother, sister, and nieces all depended on her and lived with her at various times throughout her life. So, although she had just been promoted, it was difficult for Rachel to support herself and all the members of her family. She continued to write magazine articles in addition to her job at the Fish and Wildlife Services. The event of World War II gave Rachel plenty of ideas. There was much research done about radar during World War. It inspired Rachel to write an article about bats and how their sonar skills are like radar. The article was called "The Bat Knew It First." The U.S. Navy recruiting office called it one of the clearest expositions of radar yet made available for public consumption. As a race, Rachel wanted the science of the nature world to make sense to everyone. The atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in August 1945 ended World War II. It was a relief that the war was over. Maybe life could go back to normal. But those powerful bombs made a lot of people, including Rachel, realize that the destruction could have a very bad impact on the entire planet. Rachel wanted everyone to understand that people and the decisions they made had a big effect on the environment and every other living thing. The earth had to be protected.
Added to the script for the radio was a huge success, and Mr. Higgins recommended her to write a booklet about fish. Because she had no money, she wrote it and gave it to Mr. Higgins, but he shook his head because shook his head, saying that it should be published, so you should write more details and more. You should write more easily. At that time, Rachael Calson was earning for extra money, so she doesn't have much free time. She had to work on more, so she wrote Atlantic Monthly and published it. But even if she sent it to Mr. Higgins, he said no again. He said that they need an entire book to publish. Some magazine persuaded her to write a book about her article. And by 3 years effort, they published her first book, named Under the Sea Wind. It explains how the animals' life are connected, and it got excellent review. However, unfortunately, the war had begun, so any person was reading a book. So she was discouraged by the customers. So even if she got good review, she recommended her friend to don't ever write a book. At the time, the Borough fisheries were gone to Chicago from Washington, D.C. Because the war was going on, people were eating more fish than meat, and she wrote a book about it. And although she was promoted, the whole house was all depending on her, so she had to support her and her family, and it was very difficult. Ending the World War II, the U.S. hit the atomic bomb to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but so she thought that it'd be better than having a war going on, but she realized that it has bad impact on the entire planet, and it is big effect on Earth. At that time, the U.S. Navy was researching the data of radar, and she wrote a book about bats too.